Okay, I think we're about ready to start. I'm going to be trying something this semester that I've never tried before, which is doing screen capture and audio capture, so that hopefully, probably with a bit of editing, we can make any part of the class period that's spent in explanation, presentation, whether formal or semi-formal, but anything that might be useful for you for the purpose of reviewing material or going over something, or classes missed because of illness or anything of that sort, should be able to make it up. And so we'll be trying that. We'll be starting usually right with the sound of the siren, or maybe slightly after. And we'll see how this works. So this is the first time I'm trying the actual recording process, and so I'll try not to get my hopes up in terms of that working. But in case you're wondering what that is, you've got an explanation. I want us to start by thinking about
you co-sponsored a bill requiring the display of the Ten Commandments in the House of Representatives and the Senate. Why was that important?
Well, the Ten Commandments is not a bad thing for people to understand and to respect. We're a better place that you have something like that.
Taking time away from
Okay. I'm not sure how many of you are fans of Stephen Colbert. I think I'll leave the one light off just so you can see his smiling face. Didn't mention the congressman's name so as not to have anybody picking on any particular politician or state or anything of that sort. But this was one particular congressman who was taking the stance that the public display of the Ten Commandments is important, and was advocating that and using that as something of a campaign platform. And I showed this clip under the heading of the influence of the Bible today because I don't know about you, but I already have, in the first chapter, and it's not the first time I'm using this textbook, so it's not the first time I felt this way, but I don't know about you, but I feel already like there's a bit of a tension between two things that the author was saying. Right. On the one hand, right, already on page 3, right, the start of chapter 1, saying that Americans, in things to do with whether it's afterlife, popular ideas of angels, other things, ethical ideas, Americans typically echo biblical ideas, and yet when you poll Americans, what you find is that a lot of them don't actually know much about what is in the Bible. And I already felt like there was a tension between those two statements. How on earth, if at all, can American popular culture be echoing biblical ideas if Americans in general, and most Americans in particular, don't actually know what's in the Bible? And so I thought I'd show this clip, not least because I think it provides a useful illustration of why knowing something about the Bible can be relevant, useful, important in our time. Right? There are certainly people who will use the language of the Bible or the claim to be defending or advocating biblical principles or things of that sort to garner votes, right? To sell products, to do all sorts of things. And so being able to ask some questions and possibly do something useful, like find out, does this person who's saying the display of the Ten Commandments are important, is important, actually know what any of them are? It's a question worth asking. And so it's a humorous but also, I think, a relevant clip for a class like ours. Let me start just by asking sort of impressions of the textbook so far, anything in particular that people read in there that wanted to talk about, clarify. I'll spend a little bit of time going over at least one of the subjects that was brought up. But I'm going to try and, wherever possible, use this classroom time for spending time talking about the things that you find interesting. Okay? And so I know it's early in the semester. I may be asking too much for the second day of class. But is there anything in particular in the chapter you read that you wanted to come back to or wanted to discuss, clarify, comment on, or anything of that sort? Yeah, go ahead.
I thought it was kind of interesting, like how it was almost like distracting. How it seemed like the author went out of their way to try to like not. I don't want to like in terms of, kind of like not like impede on anyone's religion, like try to make everybody happy almost, not to try to take sides with anything. So it was kind of like distracting how they did like the BCE instead of using AD and stuff like that.
Okay, yeah, that's certainly one of the things I wanted to talk about, right? Right, CE, I should write BCE above it. What do those stand for? Anybody remember? Yeah. What are they, in terms of the meaning, exactly identical to, otherwise, in terms of the date system? Yeah, so BC and AD. I don't care which you use. I sometimes go back and forth myself. I'll give you one reason, though, why I like before Common Era and Common Era. It has nothing to do with political correctness, right? Because we're still using a calendar that was devised by Christians, and so changing the name doesn't really do much. But if we go back and look at the history of it, and we'll actually spend some time talking about this subject when we get to the Gospels. According to the Gospel of Matthew, Jesus was born sometime, possibly as much as 2 years before the death of Herod the Great. Herod the Great died in the year 4 BC, which would put the birth of Jesus sometime around 6 BC. And so if it seems a little bit strange to you to say that Jesus was born 6 years before Christ, then you might decide you see something appealing about this. It's a calendar error that was made in the Middle Ages, right when they were coming up with the calendar. And so it's just a discrepancy. There's no year zero, as you're probably aware. And so you're free to use either of those. One thing I do think you'll find by the time we get to the end of this book is that certainly there are views that scholars have and things like that that not everyone will find equally appealing or equally reflective of the sort of view that they have or things that they've heard before. So we'll revisit that and see if you still have that impression later on. But certainly I used an earlier edition of this textbook some years ago, and the class actually gave the opposite impression that the author wasn't being sensitive enough to a range of viewpoints. I think I actually mentioned that to the author at one point. And so it may be that he's gone too far the other way, but we'll see how that goes. It's the first chapter, and he doesn't want to lose anyone already, and I think that's understandable. I don't want to lose anyone already either. I may have lost some of you by showing a clip from the Colbert Report. I may not have. I don't know. Yeah. Any other thoughts or things relating to the... Okay. Well, if you have any at any point, feel free to stick up a hand. I asked you to think about one particular question as you were doing the reading, and that's the question of where the table of contents comes from in the Bible, and whether and to what extent all Bibles have the same table of contents. What Bibles are the same? What Bibles are different? What parts of which Bibles are the same or different? And where does the table of contents come from? Those are some things I want us to spend some time talking about. First of all, I asked you at the end, and there was not a lot of information you were bringing to class, and that was fine, because we're here to learn, right? Just useful for me to find out what people already know and what it's useful to spend time on. Whose Bibles are different from one another? Go ahead.
In terms of the Bibles themselves, the Roman Catholic Bible is different from the Protestant Bible, and then there's some differences with the Orthodox Bible as well. They're closer to the Catholic side, but still different.
Okay, yeah, so there's one set of differences, right? If we were to compare a Protestant Bible, a Catholic Bible, and an Orthodox Bible, we'd find that all three are different. the Catholic and Orthodox Bibles would be closer to one another. The Protestant Bible would be more different from the other two. In what part of the Bible are they different? Do they differ in the New Testament? No. It's actually in what Christians call the Old Testament, and it relates to some books that are known as the Apocrypha. Some of you may have discovered, if you've taken the time to look at the table of contents and you have some connection with some sort of Protestant denomination, you may have found there are books in here that you have never had in a Bible that you've encountered before. And we'll be finding out more about those. Today we'll at least give you some general information about why these differences exist historically. Yeah, you had your hand up. What were you going to say?
I was just going to say the translations.
Mm-hmm.
I know, like, you can get books for, like, young Christians who are just
Mm-hmm.
learning about the Bible. You
Yeah.
can get them for a teenager who's
Mm-hmm.
looking at the Bible a lot differently. So, based upon your age and how you've grown
Mhm.
up, there are different
Yes.
translations.
So in addition to differences in the table of contents, there are also different translations. Some try to, although I'm not aware of any that actually does it, that is a published translation that you would buy and would read. There certainly are some attempts at literal translation that basically put the words in an interlinear form, right, the Greek or Hebrew or Aramaic and the English, and do a word-for-word, one-on-one translation. Even then, though, rarely is there, or well, I shouldn't say rarely, often there is one word in English that does perfectly well to convey the meaning and the range of meaning of the Greek and the Hebrew, but a lot of the times that's not the case. And that's one reason why there are footnotes in Bibles, right? There are footnotes in Bibles for a number of reasons, and we'll talk about some of the other reasons next time. But one of the reasons is that sometimes a Greek word can have more than one meaning, right? Sometimes a Hebrew word can have more than one meaning. Sometimes an English word can have more than one meaning, right? And the latter you're presumably all aware of. And so oftentimes in a footnote it will explain that another way this word could be translated is whatever. And so one thing I would like you to get into the habit of doing this semester is looking at footnotes. They're there. Most Bibles don't have a terrible lot of them, and so if they're there, they're probably worth looking at. What else in terms of differences between Bibles? Yeah.
I know the book talked a lot about how they ended the Old Testament, like
Mm-hmm.
how like the Protestant view ended it in kind of like a forthcoming, like a foreshadowing way, whereas the Torah is more of just kind of like the Protestant Bible was saying that the Messiah was coming, and then the Torah was kind of like a call back to Jerusalem.
Yeah. So one group that hasn't been mentioned yet, but which has something that can be called a Bible, and which overlaps with some of the canons, right? Compilations, Bibles already mentioned, is the Jewish Bible, right? Which corresponds to essentially to the Protestant Old Testament, right, in terms of its contents, but not in terms of its order, right? And that's certainly something that's worth noting, and we're going to have occasion to note certain key examples of this, because, for instance, books like 1st and 2nd Samuel, 1st and 2nd Kings, are usually grouped together with Ruth and some other things, and for the most part viewed as historical books. They're among the prophetic books in the Jewish canon. Right? And we might ask ourselves why that is. Daniel is included among the prophetic books in Christian Bibles, but in the Jewish canon is actually part of the writings. And probably that has more than anything else to do with the date when the work was written. And so we're going to spend some time thinking about date and the development of some of these lists. But it's important to note this, not least because oftentimes, right, in discussions of the Bible or religious matters, it's possible to take the Bible as a given, right, and then carry on. But in actual fact, what we're dealing with here is not one book that came prepackaged, right? We're dealing with a collection. And if we're dealing with a collection, then it's important to ask the question, when, where, how does this collection come about? Right? Who put it together? How unanimous or otherwise was the decision? Unless we can answer those kinds of questions, we're not really going to know what we're dealing with. We're not going to know why whatever Bible we're talking about, and whatever the differences between them, why they have the similarities and differences that they do. And so the one thing I want to do in terms of taking some time to explain some stuff is to just run through quickly some of the history of the development of the canon of the Bible. What is a canon? C-A-N-O-N. It is an official list of writings that's viewed as scripture. Canon, C-A-N-O-N, is also a camera company. That has no relevance to our discussion today. And Canon, with two N's in the middle, and one at the end, is a weapon. The way some people use the Bible may have led to additional confusion between the two, right? Possibly. But when we're talking about canon, C-A-N-O-N, we're talking about a list of essentially the table of contents, right, that some group regards as authoritative, right? These books are regarded as scripture, and what that means, right, in terms of sacredness and how they're viewed, will also differ between different denominations, between different religions, between different traditions. But all of them have lists that list contents. We'll start with the earliest texts, right? What in the Jewish Bible, or the Jewish Bible is often referred to as the Tanak, right? Which is basically T-N-K, in fact, Hebrew letters corresponding to these English letters, standing for Torah, Nevi'im, Ketuvim, right? The Torah, the first 5 books, the prophets, and the writings. And so this is an abbreviation, as it were, an acronym that's sometimes used for the Jewish Bible, which corresponds to a greater or lesser extent with the Old Testament in terms of content for all Christians, and is the same as the Protestant Old Testament for reasons that I'll explain in a little while. And during a period of roughly a millennium, give or take, the books that we are talking about were written. Some would say that it's much less than that, right? A few hundred years towards the end of that spectrum. But in at least some cases, there may have been, if not earlier editions of these books, at the very least written sources that were used in the creation of them. And one of the things we're going to spend some time talking about is the question of sources, right? And that's important for making sense of text sometimes. If you've got what seem to be two different accounts of the same thing, why are there two different ones, right? It may have something to do with sources. It's also useful for historians because if we're going to ask, what can we know about events recorded in these texts? If they were written down half a millennium after the purported events, historians are probably not going to have a lot of confidence in terms of reliable information being passed on then. Right? If you had if you were tested on your organic chemistry knowledge 500 years after you were taught the course, you might have forgotten something. Right? That's probably not a good example, but I figure organic chemistry, it's on everybody's minds and going to be increasingly so. I won't reference it too much just to not have you associate this course with organic chemistry, which I'm sure none of you. No, I won't say anymore. Okay. And so when these texts were written, we're going to actually deal with them on an individual basis as we talk about them. But certainly in the years BC or BCE. Sometime around the year 200 BC or BCE, the Torah, that's the first 5 books of the Bible, are translated into Greek. And that translation is called the Septuagint, often abbreviated as LXX, right? Not because it's the extra large Bible or the opposite of the extra large Bible or something else like that. But it comes from a tradition that a group of 70, or in some versions 72, but the abbreviation comes from the version that has 70 translators all going into separate rooms to do their translation from Hebrew into Greek. And when they come out, lo and behold, all their translations agree. That's the legend. If you've ever translated something, you may be skeptical of it, and most scholars are. Presumably the story was circulated because this was, as far as we know, the first translation of this part of the Jewish scriptures into another language. And so the question of how authoritative is the translation is one that was natural for people to ask, right? Because languages, right, even if you translate something, it's never going to convey exactly the meaning in every respect that was there in the original language.
Oh, okay. So I accidentally read the wrong book for today.
Oh, okay.
But I did read the preface in the beginning of the Access Bible,
Mm-hmm.
and they were talking about how when Mary Magdalene and Mary the mother of I can't remember, but they went to the tomb to see Jesus, and then someone had met them there and told them that Jesus had risen. That there are like 3 different versions of that alone. That there's one that they left in fear and never told anyone, but then they said that would be odd because they had to write it out, and I just found that funny. Does that relate back to this, or is this translations?
Yeah, well, right.
Sorry.
Okay, one of the things we are going to, and one good thing about the Access Bible and what you read at this stage is that the introductory part covers a lot of the same stuff that's in the textbook, right?
Okay.
Where do these texts come from? How do the compilations come about? But what you're referring to is the fact that in the New Testament, right, we have 4 Gospels. In the Hebrew Bible or Old Testament, we have books that overlap in their contents, but not precisely, right? And so the question of how do these books that overlap in some ways or have parallel material, how do they relate to one another? We are going to spend some time on that, both in Old Testament examples or Hebrew Bible examples and in New Testament examples. But what we're talking about here is simply the taking of a Hebrew text, and one of the things we'll need to talk about is, what Hebrew text are we talking about, right? What Greek text if we're talking about the New Testament? Where are the originals of the works that are included in the Bible? Excellent answer. You're right on target. We don't have them. Right? There's no conspiracy theory that they're not in a Vatican archive where nobody, under locked guard and nobody's allowed to see them, or something else that Dan Brown might write about in novels. I'll mention Dan Brown at least once more today. The truth of the matter is that we don't have the originals, and so the question of what do translators do, right, in terms of translating the Bible, what text are they using? That's what we're going to spend some time on next time. Right? For this time, what I want us to focus on is the question of how does the table of contents come about? Right? How do these contents end up compiled together, and who's involved in discussing the question? Right? The reason I'm telling you about the translation of the Jewish scriptures into Greek is this. The earliest Christians, right, Jesus' original followers, presumably most of them, if not all of them, had Aramaic as their mother tongue. Some of them may also have known Greek. As Christianity spreads beyond Galilee and Jerusalem and Judea and those kinds of areas where Aramaic is the dominant language, the predominant language in the eastern part of the Roman Empire was Greek. And even across areas where other languages were spoken, Greek was a sort of lingua franca, right? So it was used by many people, was known by very large numbers of people. And so as Christianity spreads and increasingly is finds adherents among non-Jews, Greek is the one language they have in common. Greek is the language in which the New Testament works are written. And in terms of the earliest Bible that Christians have, it's the Jewish scriptures. And for Greek-speaking Jewish Christians and then eventually non-Jewish Christians, it was the Greek translation of the Jewish scriptures. And that's the reason why the translation of the Jewish scriptures into Greek is being mentioned, because it's going to be part of the explanation of why many Christians don't have the same Old Testament, or don't have an Old Testament that corresponds to the Jewish canon of Scripture. Right? In that Greek translation, it's not simply a translation of Hebrew originals, but some works that were composed in Greek are going to be included in there. And in addition, there are also going to be slightly different versions. So on the one hand, you have books like 1st and 2nd Maccabees, which tell about events in subsequent history. And one of them seems to have had a Hebrew or Aramaic original, but which no longer survives. Works that were, for the most part, composed in Greek. But there are also books like Daniel, which have additional material, right? There are stories that are in the Greek version of Daniel that are not in the Hebrew Bible. And I'll get you to look at least one of them later on in the semester. At some point, and Jewish tradition dates it to the 1st century, although in a period at least slightly later than the writing of most of the New Testament works. And there's some dispute about the historicity of this tradition, but at the very least, later Jewish tradition said that towards the end of the 1st century, after the destruction of the temple in Jerusalem by the Romans, rabbis got together and hammered out a list of texts that were going to be considered scripture. And the list, as it ends up appearing, essentially corresponds to those works that are in Hebrew, or Hebrew with a little bit of Aramaic, and none of those works that are only found in Greek and only found in the Greek translation of the scriptures, right? And so what happens at this point is that Greek-speaking Christians who are using the Septuagint and Jews with their Hebrew Bible have different canons, right, starting from this point. And it won't be long until Christians start to notice this. Jerome translates the Bible from Hebrew and Greek into Latin. At this point, Christianity is spread also to the western part of the Roman Empire, and so Latin is an important language increasingly. 405 CE. And he's aware that, on the one hand, Christians are using Greek versions of the Jewish scriptures, which include other books, but that the Jews have in Hebrew 39 books, and he wants the Christian Old Testament to reflect that. And so, Tobit, Judas, 1st and 2nd Maccabees, the Wisdom of Solomon, the Wisdom of Jesus ben Sira, sometimes called Ecclesiasticus, and Baruch, and calls these books Apocrypha, which means hidden books. The Pope at that time wants the traditionally used books to be included, and so they are included. But this is just an example of the fact that already at this stage there's some discussion among Christians about whether the traditional Old Testament, right, the Greek version, or the canon that's accepted among the Jews should be regarded as the Old Testament by Christians. We'll fast forward a bit to the Reformation. Right? Martin Luther translates the Bible from Hebrew and Greek to German, and using logic similar to Jerome's, about 1,000 years earlier, assumes that since Jews wrote the Old Testament, theirs is the correct canon, and so he moves those other books to an appendix, which he calls the Apocrypha. And as a result, Protestants have an Old Testament that corresponds to the Jewish canon. Right? It's through the removal of those books that were found in the Septuagint and found traditionally in Christian Bibles, but which were not found in the Jewish canon. And there's even some diversity among Protestants. Right? Anglicans use the Apocrypha, but there are some contrasting views and contrasting statements among Anglicans or Episcopalians. In fact, I know what Anglicans think. I'm not so sure what Episcopalians think, and these days, oftentimes, the two are different. So, and I'm guessing we have no Episcopalians here because nobody knows what I was talking about, but you can ignore it. It's not important. In response to the Protestant Reformation, right, the Roman Catholic Council of Trent reaffirms the canonicity of all 46 books that are in their collection. And so, from this period on, right, you have a Protestant Old Testament that corresponds to the Jewish canon, and you have Catholic and Orthodox Old Testaments that are slightly different from one another, but which include works that were found in Greek collections, but not in Hebrew. And so that's the Old Testament in a whirlwind tour. Any thoughts, comments, or questions before we move on to the New Testament and give you a whirlwind tour of that as well?
Will these PowerPoints be on Blackboard?
What I'm hoping to do is actually give you the PowerPoints with audio, right? Okay. And so if it works, you will have that. If it doesn't, I will go back and try and redo it. So one way or another, you will have this. And as I said, I'm not going to be testing you on these dates. Most of these dates, if I didn't write them down, I would not remember. I have a terrible head for numbers, and I'm not going to be expecting you to remember things that I have trouble remembering myself. one of the great things is that there's biblical precedent for this, right? You know, you have trouble remembering, you know or you think you know it says it somewhere, and you can't remember where. And another great line from Hebrews, as it's found in the King James Version, says, "Someone somewhere solemnly said," right? And then you get a quote from the Scriptures. So, yeah, it's biblical to not always be able to remember where something was found. Right? There we go. Okay, moving on to the New Testament. I promised you another mention of Dan Brown, and this is not a good place to look for a reliable account. Read Da Vinci Code, read Angels and Demons. They're page turners. They are not accurate, reliable source of information about church history. And the impression that Brown gives in this particular book, that Constantine gathers together people, they've got hundreds of gospels, and they say, pick 4 that'll make the case for Jesus' divinity, or something like that. Badly wrong. Completely off target. And if you want to get a sense of Dan Brown's sort of the precision of his concern for precision of information about the Bible, in the prequel to the Da Vinci Code, Angels and Demons, at one point he wants to make a reference to the book of Judges in the Bible, and he calls it Judgments. And so apparently looking at the top of the page, right, where they give the name of the book, was too much research for him to consider it worth his time. And so hopefully, if nothing else, that will persuade you that doesn't seem to have taken the time to inform himself, except about some very unusual views that scholars don't find persuasive. So what is the story, then? Roughly between 50 and sometime early in the 2nd century CE, the books of today's New Testament are written. Right? During the same period, there are other Christian writings that, and in a lot of cases, right, apart from, say, the letters of Paul, where we have a somewhat narrow time frame, there's a lot of uncertainty about the date of some of these works. Great website for Dan Brown fans as well as anyone else interested in the subject. Early Christian Writings, right, includes these works, which are written roughly in the same time period, more or less, as some of the New Testament writings, or at least have the possibility of overlapping with them. At earlychristianwritings.com, you'll also find the Gnostic Gospels and various other things. If you're interested in those, next semester I teach a course that probably should, for accuracy and advertising, be called Extra-Canonical Early Christian Literature. Instead, the class is called Heresy, because that sounds more interesting. But it's looking at these works, both heretical and not heretical, right, by the judgment of later Christians, that are not found in the New Testament or indeed in anyone's canon of Scripture. And so if you're interested in those kinds of subjects, there's going to be a course that you'll probably find interesting next semester. Which are our earliest writings in the New Testament? Which are probably written first? Yeah, seems to have been Paul's letters. There have been arguments that one of the Gospels, or at the very least, perhaps a source used by the Gospels, may have been written relatively early. But in terms of the consensus view is that Paul's letters were written first. And that will create some interesting questions as we approach the New Testament, because you really can't read the letters of Paul and make sense of them without knowing something about this Jesus figure that he's talking about, and that seems to involve reading the Gospels. But in terms of chronology and trying to trace the development of Christian thought and Christian writings, we might have wanted to arrange the order differently. Right? We'll come back to that when we get to the New Testament. In the 2nd century, Marcion, a businessman in Rome, who is part of the church there, teaches that there were 2 gods. And before you faint with shock or horror, you'll find that, in fact, the distinction he's making is one that almost sounds like some views that you'd encounter today. Right? He talks about the God of the Old Testament as this cruel and angry sort of figure, compared with the loving Father of the New Testament. the church declares this heresy and expels Marcion. This view, though, of a distinction that supposedly can be made between the Old Testament and the New Testament still persists, though. And you'll sometimes encounter people who have this impression that the depiction of God in these two parts of the Bible, that too is something we can talk about later. So Marcion, because of his views, eliminates the Old Testament and says the Jewish scripture is not the Christian scripture, and puts together a list of scripture which includes letters of Paul, including one to the Laodiceans. What exactly that was is not exactly clear. Includes one gospel, the Gospel of Luke, which is truncated, edited, or mutilated, or whatever you want to call it, in order to remove some of the things that emphasize Jesus' connectedness to Judaism and the Jewish scriptures. In response to Marcion's list, the developing mainstream church, what will develop into orthodoxy, not with a small o, right? And so the church that eventually evolves into the heritage of Protestants, Catholics, and Orthodox with a big O, responds by putting together a list of scripture. And Irenaeus is one of the first people that we know of who actually does this, and does it in response to Marcion. And on the one hand, you'll notice that there are some works that are now in the New Testament that are lacking. And on the other hand, you'll notice that Shepherd of Hermas, which I'm guessing some of you have never heard of, and most, if not all of you, have never read, is included on the list. And perhaps at this point it'll be useful to point out something that was true both of the Hebrew Bible and of the New Testament. It's not simply a case that either everything is uncertain or that everything is certain. For the most part, in both cases, what we find is that there are a core of older texts, which were written relatively early, which are generally accepted by everyone who identifies themselves as Jews or as Christians. And then around the margins, there are some which are disputed, and there are debates about them, right? And that's important to note because, for the most part, what serves as the core of the Jewish scriptures, what serves as the core of the Christian scripture, as these canons are developing, are those texts which are most widely used and most widely accepted. Right? And so that's really what drives things more than anything else. There will be councils, there will be debates. For the most part, they're not about all the texts. They're about some of them which are disputed. Right? And so there we have it. Right? There's core and periphery. Sometime around the turn of the 2nd to 3rd century, another famous list is thought to have been put together. There's some debate about when this one dates from, but it includes a list which seems to have mentioned all 4 Gospels. Right? It's actually a fragmentary text, and so we don't have the start of it. That's why there's some uncertainty. Includes 2 of the 3 letters of John, letters of Paul, Jude. Doesn't include Hebrews, James, Revelation. Does include the Apocalypse of Peter, right? Another text that eventually fails to make it into the New Testament. In the early 300s, right, 4th century, Eusebius of Caesarea writes down a classification of books as recognized, disputed, spurious, and heretical. Right? And so really that's what we're talking about, right? When we're talking about a canon of scripture. What texts are recognized by this group to the extent that it's organized and has the ability to make some definitive statements about the matter. And so a lot depends on the structure of the church, the authority, geographical spread, and how much these various groups are in relation with one another as they're discussing these things. One thing that's noteworthy about Eusebius is that he, on the one hand, recognizes that a lot of people feel strongly that Revelation should be part of Scripture. On the other hand, there are people who feel very strongly that it shouldn't be part of Scripture and would actually regard it as spurious. In between the spurious, ones that he thinks, or at least many Christians would say, are not scriptural, not authoritative, there are those disputed ones. Right? And as you can see, for the most part, it's a small handful. And spurious was not the same as heretical. Right? So there are ones which thought were not actually written by who they claim to be written by, were not from apostles, not from eyewitnesses, not from authoritative sources, but not necessarily because they contained false teaching or something from Eusebius's perspective. They simply were not old enough and widely used enough to be considered scripture. The first list that's drawn up of a New Testament that exactly corresponds to the one that we have today is in the 4th century, and so it's not at the Council of Nicaea, right? It's not Constantine, it's not Dan Brown, it's not happening according to that scenario, although Athanasius wasn't very much involved in the debates that led up to the Council of Nicaea, and he's the first to come up with this list that's canonical, that corresponds to what we have today. Even then, though, there's going to continue to be some debate, and what's interesting is that one of probably the book that took the longest and became part of Scripture with the most difficulty was the book of Revelation. And for people reading the New Testament today, it's there, it rounds off Scripture, it's at the end, it seems like, it's got to be there. It's a bookend, it kind of closes off the story. But during 5th, 6th, 7th century, the Eastern churches are still debating it. Right? Get into the 9th century, and Patriarch of Constantinople, right, head of the Eastern churches, still doesn't include it in his list of canonical works, and becomes part of the New Testament for Orthodox Christians so late that even though it's now regarded as scripture, it still doesn't feature in the Orthodox liturgy because it becomes part of that Bible so late. In 1442, the Council of Florence, right, the entire Western Church, just in time for the Reformation, almost, right? Not going to be long until that happens, recognizes the 27 books. Martin Luther actually called into question the New Testament canon, and there were some works which, precisely because he felt that they did not convey this essential teaching as he identified it of justification by faith, placed them towards the end of the Bible, and they're still found there in German Bibles today, and proposed removing a few of them from the canon. Most Protestants did not agree with him. And even in German Bibles, they're there, even though the order differs somewhat. So that's the formulation of the New Testament canon. And the reason I'm telling you this is because if we're going to try and get back into the context in which some of these texts are written, one of the things that it can sometimes be particularly challenging to do, right, if we want to situate texts in their original context, is to recognize that at a time when Paul's writing his letters, for instance, he's not thinking, oh, I'm writing scripture. Right? And so when we read Paul's letters, if we're connected with some kind of religious tradition that regards them as scripture, it might seem obvious that Paul's right, okay, because it's there, it's in the Bible. Right? At the time when Paul is writing these letters, though, he is trying to persuade people, and not everybody is convinced, right? And so sometimes it's hard to put ourselves back into the context in which these things are written and to hear what they might have sounded like for that initial audience. I have a what-if question that I want to get you to talk about for a few minutes, and this will be the last thing we'll do today. And we'll come back to it at the start of class next time. Or maybe, I think we maybe have just enough time. If there was a discovery made today, somebody finds a text and they're sure it's Paul, it's a letter of Paul, right? Should it be added to the Bible? What do you think? Just take some time and think about that now. Talk with some people around you. Let's say groups not more than, let's say, 4 or 5, just that everybody's involved in the conversation. Do you think it should be added? Do you think it would be added to the Bible? If a letter of Paul was found today, hadn't been previously known, and they're confident it's authentic. What do you think?